Pay $12,000 within 30 days, or the HOA will start placing liens on your homes. That was the notice sent to all 63 families in Silver Pines, our HOA president. Marlene Taker claimed the private roads were failing, the drainage system was collapsing, and the clubhouse needed emergency repairs. But I remembered one number, $934,280. That was how much our last financial report says we had sitting in the reserve fund. So before I handed over another $12,000, I asked Marlene one simple question. Where did the money go? She would to answer. 3 days later, instead of a bank statement, I received a formal warning accusing me of harassing the HOA board. That was when I stopped treating this like a budgeting dispute. Because Marlene thought I was just another quiet homeowner she could intimidate. What she didn't know was that I had spent 20 years tracing financial losses through construction projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And when I finally got a look at the reserve account, I understood why she wanted me quiet. The balance wasn't $934,280. It was $14,227. Roughly $920,000 was gone, and that was only the first thing I found. 3 weeks earlier, Silver Pines still looked like the kind of neighborhood where nothing serious ever happened. 63 homes sat behind one gated entrance, wrapped around a landscaped lake and a clubhouse most of us barely used. We had almost 4 miles of private road, our own drainage system, a security gate, lake maintenance, landscaping, and the usual collection of amenities HOAs like to brag about in real estate listings. None of it was cheap. Every homeowner already paid $540 a month in dues. Part of that money covered routine expenses. Another portion was supposed to build the reserve fund for major repairs. That was the entire purpose of having reserves you save during the quiet years, so you don't have to panic when a road actually fails or a roof genuinely needs replacing. So when Marlene's letter arrived, I read it twice, then a third time. The board was declaring what it called an infrastructure emergency. The roads were supposedly deteriorating faster than expected. The drainage system was approaching failure. The clubhouse roof needed immediate attention, and according to the letter, every one of the 63 households had 30 days to contribute an additional $12,000. That meant the board wanted another $756,000 from the neighborhood. There was no payment plan, no detailed engineering report, no itemized contractor bids, no explanation of what had happened to the reserve money we had already paid. Just a deadline. And a warning. Miss the payment and homeowners could face late fees, collection costs, legal action, and eventually a lien. I walked outside with the letter still in my hand before retiring. I had spent years reviewing construction budgets and investigating losses, and I had learned something very simple. Real emergencies usually leave evidence, so I started looking. I walked the private roads. There were cracks, a few patched areas, normal wear near curves and drainage points, but nothing that looked like a neighborhood on the edge of infrastructure collapse. Then I checked the drainage areas. No collapsed culverts, no major washouts, no flooded shoulders, no visible failure that justified panic. The clubhouse roof was even stranger. From the ground, the shingles looked relatively new. That triggered a memory. I went home, opened the previous year's HOA financial report, and found the number I had been thinking about. $934,280, nearly $1 million had supposedly been sitting in our reserves less than a year earlier. I wasn't accusing anyone of stealing, not then. There could have been legitimate expenses I didn't know about. Insurance deductibles, emergency repairs, contracts approved before I started paying attention. There were plenty of innocent explanations, and one bank statement could have cleared up all of them. So I emailed Marlene. I asked for 3 things: the current reserve balance, the latest bank statement, and a list of major reserve expenditures from the previous 12 months. Her response came the next morning. She didn't provide a single number. Instead, she told me the HOA's financial records were sensitive and that homeowners should trust spending decisions already approved by the board. That bothered me more than the $12,000 bill. This wasn't Marlene's private account, it was our money, so instead of arguing, I opened the Silver Pines governing documents. I found the section covering financial inspections. The language was clear. Homeowners had the right to review association financial records, including expenditures and statements. I copied the relevant language into a second email. No accusations, no threats, no dramatic language, just the rule. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. For about 5 seconds, I thought they had finally sent me the records they hadn't too. It was a formal warning. According to the board, my repeated requests were creating a hostile environment and constituted harassment of volunteer board members. I had sent 2 polite emails, and somehow asking where our money had gone was now harassment. That was the moment my concern changed. Until then, I was still willing to believe this might be incompetence. Maybe the books were disorganized. Maybe Marlene was defensive. Maybe the board had made some bad decisions and didn't want to admit it. But people don't usually threaten you for asking a harmless question unless they're afraid of the answer. So I started a file, every email, every letter, every financial report I already possessed, dates, names, amounts. I wrote everything down. Then I began talking quietly to neighbors who had lived in Silver Pines longer than I had. That was how I got to know Wayne Prescott. Wayne had lived there for almost 20 years. When I showed him the assessment letter, he shook his head. This isn't the first time. Over the previous 4 years, residents had been charged for security upgrades, lake work, landscaping projects, gate repairs, storm damage, and emergency maintenance. Some of it sounded familiar. Some of it didn't. Then Wayne said something that stayed with me. Funny thing is, nobody ever sees the contracts. That afternoon, I added a page to my folder at the top. I wrote one question. What exactly have we been paying for? I didn't have to wait long for another clue. Marlene called an emergency HOA meeting. The clubhouse was almost full when I arrived. Marlene sat at the front beside board members Denise Caldwell and Beverly Stanton. Behind them was a projector screen. The first slide showed a close-up of cracked pavement. The second showed water in a drainage ditch. The third showed the clubhouse roof from an angle that made it look far worse than it appeared from the ground. Marlene stood and called the situation an infrastructure crisis. Then she put the estimates on the screen. Road repairs, drainage work, clubhouse repairs. Together, the projected costs were well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet there were no itemized bids attached. No engineer standing there to explain the findings, no contractor breakdown, no procurement history, just large round numbers and a demand for $12,000 from each household. A homeowner across the room finally raised his hand. What's the current balance in the reserve fund? Beverly answered before Marlene could. She said the reserve had been depleted by years of emergency expenses. That was the first time anyone on the board had openly admitted most of the money was gone. So I stood. I didn't give a speech. I asked 3 questions. What is the exact current reserve balance? Who approved the largest expenditures? And why haven't homeowners been shown the bank statements? The room went completely silent. Marlene stared at me for a moment. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile people use when they've decided you are easier to attack than your question. She reminded everyone I had only lived in Silver Pines for a few years, she said. I didn't understand the complexity of managing a private community. Then she accused me of creating panic because I wanted to avoid paying my fair share. Denise followed with the threat. Anyone who failed to pay the assessment could face fines, legal fees, collections, and eventually a lien. A few homeowners looked down. That told me something important. Marlene was controlling the room because everyone trusted her. She was controlling it because people were afraid of what the HOA could do to their homes. The meeting ended without a single bank statement being shown. As I was leaving, a woman named Loretta Gaines caught up with me near the door. Loretta had worked in banking before retirement and had lived in Silver Pines for years. She slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. I kept this before they moved everything online, she whispered. I opened it in the parking lot. It was an old financial report. At the bottom of the page was the reserve balance. $934,280. I looked back at the clubhouse. If Marlene was telling the truth, nearly $1 million had been legitimately spent in less than a year. If she was T, the $12,000 assessment was T, the emergency. It was the cover. 2 days later, I sent a certified request to inspect the HOA's financial records. This time Marlene didn't respond personally. An attorney did. I was allowed 2 hours at the management office. No photographs, no copies. Nothing could leave the room. I had questions about those restrictions, but I wasn't interested in wasting another week arguing. I wanted the numbers. When I arrived, Denise was already waiting. She sat across from me while 3 thick folders were placed on the table. The records were a mess, missing pages, unsigned photocopies. Invoices with almost no supporting documentation, expenses described with phrases like emergency maintenance, consulting services, and urgent community work. I worked quietly. Denise watched me the entire time. Then I found the statement. I checked the account number, the date, and finally the balance. 14,227. I stared at it for a second, less than a year earlier. Silver Pines had reported more than $934,000 in reserves. Now there was barely $14,000 left. The difference was a little over $920,000. Denise must have seen something change in my face. Is there a problem? I looked up. No, then I kept reading. Because finding the hole was only half the job, the important question was where the money had gone. That was when one company name began appearing again and again. Everheart Community Services. One invoice described road maintenance, another said lake consulting, another listed landscaping, then roof inspection, drainage work, security services. Project management. According to our records, Everheart could apparently do almost anything. The invoices shared the same strange qualities, round amounts, vague descriptions. Very little supporting detail. Many were approved by Marlene or Beverly. 48,000, 42,500, 47,000, 39,800. Again and again, I wrote down as much as I could before Denise finally closed the folder. Your time is up. I packed my notebook and left. I didn't confront Marlene. I didn't tell Denise what I had noticed. I went home and started building a timeline because money doesn't disappear. It moves, and when it moves, it leaves tracks. The next morning, Wayne and I started checking the projects in person. The first invoice on my list was for $84,000, security camera modernization. According to the paperwork, Silver Pines had paid for a major neighborhood-wide upgrade. Wayne laughed when I read it. We drove to the locations where the cameras were supposed to be. We found 3 old units. One had a cracked housing. Another was pointed at almost nothing useful. There was no modern $84,000 security system. Next came the lake. The records showed $126,000 for treatment, environmental consulting, and shoreline work. Wayne had lived beside that lake for almost 2 decades. He couldn't remember any major treatment project. Neither could Loretta. No closure notices, no contractor equipment, no temporary barriers, no visible evidence of major shoreline work. Then we checked the clubhouse roof. More than $71,000 had been billed for work connected to its replacement and inspection, but Loretta had an older insurance record showing that most of the roof replacement after storm damage had already been covered. So why was the HOA paying another enormous amount? The list kept growing. Landscaping invoices described trees we couldn't find. Drainage bills referenced improvements that didn't appear to exist. Another payment covered lake lighting. Wayne and I walked the shoreline after dark. No new lights. By the end of the day, my notebook looked less like a maintenance budget and more like a list of imaginary projects. But imaginary projects don't cash real checks. Someone had, so I went back to Everheart Community Services. Public business records gave me an owner, Miles Everheart. The name meant nothing to me. At first, I kept searching old addresses, property records, business registrations, and eventually I found something that made me stop. Years earlier, Miles Everheart had been connected to a vacation property. There was another name on that record, Marlene Whitaker. Our HOA president. I printed the page and placed it beside my notes for the first time. I had a documented connection between the person approving payments and the person behind the company receiving them. It didn't prove theft, but it changed the question. I was no longer asking where the reserve fund had gone. I was asking how much of it had gone to people Marlene already knew. Then I noticed something else. The largest payments rarely appeared as one enormous transaction. They had been divided. 48,000, 47,500, 42,000, 39,800, again and again, large enough to drain the account, small enough to look less alarming when viewed one at a time. I lined those payments up against previous special assessments. A pattern appeared. Fresh money came in from homeowners. Within weeks, Everheart was paid. Another assessment, another payment, then another. Loretta helped me compare the dates with old HOA meeting minutes. That created an entirely new problem. Some meetings supposedly approved more than 100,000 in spending in under 2 minutes. No meaningful discussion, no competing bids, no explanation of scope. Just a motion, a second, and an approval. I had spent enough years around serious project budgets to know that responsible organizations do not approve 6 figures of construction work in 90 seconds. Then, I noticed the language. Emergency authority, immediate community need board discretion. The same phrases appeared again and again. The minutes read less like records of actual discussions and more like paperwork created to justify decisions that had already been made. Several invoices also referred to storm damage. So I checked the dates against local weather records. Some of the supposed storm emergencies occurred during periods with little significant rainfall. That was when I stopped thinking about bad accounting. Bad accounting creates mistakes. This was creating explanations. Marlene, meanwhile, became more aggressive. Another community notice warned residents about misinformation. She claimed anyone questioning the assessment was delaying critical repairs and putting property values at risk. Some neighbors stopped talking to me in public. One man pulled me aside and admitted he thought something was wrong. Then he said I can't risk a lien on my house. I understood. That was how Marlene maintained control. She didn't need everyone to believe her. She only needed them to be afraid of challenging her. But pressure affects everyone, and while the homeowners were becoming quieter, someone inside the board was becoming nervous. Beverly Stanton had signed several of the approvals in my notes. At the next meeting, she barely spoke. She avoided looking at Marlene. When the discussion turned to collecting the new assessment, Beverly stared at the table. Afterward, I found a folded note tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. 6 words, you need to see the emails. No signature. I had a pretty good idea who had left it. The next evening, Beverly called from a number I didn't recognize. She didn't say hello. She just said, "Not over the phone. We met in the back corner of a diner 2 towns away." Beverly looked exhausted. She kept checking the windows before sliding a flash drive across the table. "I didn't understand what was happening at first," she said. "What's on this emails? Draft minutes, payment approvals." She paused, and things Marlene told us not to keep. Beverly admitted she had approved invoices because Marlene repeatedly described them as emergencies. She had been told the work was already underway and that delaying payment could expose the HOA to lawsuits. At first, Beverly believed her. Then the amounts grew, the documentation got thinner, and every time Beverly asked questions, Marlene gave her some version of the same answer. Trust the process, protect the community, don't create problems. I opened the files when I got home. Within minutes, I understood why Beverly was frightened. There were email chains discussing payments to Everheart before some of the supposed emergency projects had even been presented to the board. There were draft meeting minutes created before meetings took place. There were messages discussing the need to keep certain expenditures below internal review limits. Then I found the message that changed everything. It concerned the new 12,000 assessment. Marlene wasn't talking about roads. She was talking about drainage. She was talking about timing. The money needed to be collected quickly before the annual financial review. Before more homeowners requested records. Before anyone compared the current reserve balance with the previous year. I read it 3 times. The new assessment was simply another questionable demand. It appeared to be an attempt to refill the reserve before someone realized how much had already disappeared. Beverly had also saved internal spreadsheets. I compared them with the reports homeowners had been given. The numbers didn't match. Payments appeared under different descriptions. Expenses had been shifted between categories. Everheart transactions were buried under labels like maintenance, consulting, and emergency services. By 2 in the morning, I had 3 versions of Silver Pines sitting on my table. What homeowners had been told, what the numbers showed, and what the board had been saying privately. They were 3 completely different stories. The next morning, Marlene sent another community-wide email. She called the allegations against the board dangerous misinformation. She claimed anyone interfering with the assessment was putting all 63 homes at risk. For the first time, I didn't respond. I didn't ask for another meeting. I didn't challenge her publicly. And I didn't tell her Beverly had talked. I was done arguing with the HOA. Now I needed to put the evidence in front of people. The HOA couldn't threaten with fines. I copied everything. Twice. Then I made a phone call. The conversation was brief. I explained that I was a Silver Pines homeowner, that roughly $920,000 appeared to be missing from our reserve fund, and that I had records pointing to false invoices, related party payments, altered documentation, and an attempt to collect another $756,000 from residents. The person on the other end didn't ask for my theories. They asked for dates, amounts, names, documents. That was exactly the kind of conversation I understood. Over the following days, I organized everything, the old reserve report. My notes from the bank statement showing 14,227 Everheart invoices, the payment timeline, photographs of projects we couldn't find, public records connecting Miles Everheart to Marlene. The split transactions, draft meeting minutes, Beverly's emails, and the message about collecting the new assessment before the annual review. I labeled every page, cross-referenced every amount, made digital copies. Then I turned the material over. After that, I went quiet. No more arguments with Marlene. No more public accusations. No more questions at HOA meetings. And from her perspective, nothing happened. Days passed. Then more days. Marlene got bolder. She started telling residents that the financial rumors had been disproven. She suggested my silence meant I had finally realized I was wrong. What she didn't know was that other people were now asking questions. I couldn't see records were being preserved. Information was being checked, and Beverly was cooperating. Then Marlene announced one final emergency meeting. Attendance was strongly encouraged. The board would hold a vote confirming the $12,000 special assessment and begin collection procedures immediately afterward. Marlene wanted the entire community in one room. She wanted a public victory. For once, I was happy to give her exactly what she wanted. The night before the meeting, Wayne called me. "Are you going to say anything tomorrow?" "No." Nothing. There was a pause. Then he laughed. I'm starting to know that voice. The clubhouse was packed the next evening. Every chair was taken. People stood along the walls. All 63 households were represented. Marlene sat at the front with Denise beside her. Beverly's chair was empty. Marlene kept glancing at it, then she tapped the microphone. She talked about responsibility, community values, infrastructure, property values, and homeowners who had damaged trust by spreading fear. Then she lifted the assessment packet, $12,000 per home. She said, 30 days, no exceptions. Several people looked toward me. I stayed in my chair. Marlene noticed for the first time in weeks she looked relaxed. She thought I had surrendered. Then, the door at the back of the clubhouse opened. 3 people stepped inside. None of them lived in Silver Pines. They didn't announce themselves immediately. They simply walked forward. Plain clothes, dark jackets, credentials visible at their waists. The room changed before most people understood what was happening. Marlene lowered the microphone. "Can I help you?" The man in front looked directly at her, Marlene Whitaker. Her expression tightened. "Yes." He showed his credentials. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody moved for months. Marlene had been the loudest person in every room. Now she was silent. Another agent asked Denise Caldwell to remain seated. A third moved toward the side of the room. Marlene stood. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The agent didn't argue with her. He placed paperwork on the table. Marlene looked down then toward the crowd. 63 households were watching. Same homeowners she had threatened with fines, the same families she had warned about liens, the same people she had just ordered to pay another $12,000. Then she looked at me. "You did this." I stayed seated. "No." I looked at the papers on the table. The records did. The agent asked Marlene to place her hands behind her back. For a moment she resisted verbally. She started talking fast. Emergency spending, board authority, contractors, community needs, the same phrases we had heard over and over. Only this time there was nobody in the room required to pretend those words answered anything. The handcuffs closed. Nobody cheered. That surprised me. People just watched. Some looked stunned, some angry, others relieved. Denise was escorted away next. She demanded explanations. The agents didn't litigate the case in front of the neighborhood. They simply carried out the warrant. Then someone mentioned another name, Miles Everheart. That was when the room finally erupted. People began talking at once. One homeowner shouted that his family had paid 3 special assessments in 4 years. Another wanted to know whether any of the projects had been real. Someone else demanded an immediate independent audit. Marlene turned toward the room as she was led out. She still looked like she expected someone to defend her. Nobody did. Loretta stood near the back wall. Wayne was beside her. He slowly shook his head. 4 years, he said. 4 years! I looked at the assessment packets, still sitting on the board table. 63 homes, $12,000 each. Another $756,000 Marlene had been trying to collect. If everyone had simply paid without asking questions, there was no telling how much longer the cycle might have continued. One of the agents remained behind. He told us the investigation was ongoing. There were additional accounts to trace, more records to review, more people to interview. The arrests didn't answer every question that night. But one thing changed immediately. The special assessment vote was finished. Marlene's chair sat empty at the front of the room. Her microphone was still on, and for the first time in years. People in Silver Pines were asking questions without first looking over their shoulders. The arrests didn't put the missing money back overnight. A forensic audit followed. Contracts were reviewed. Payments were traced. The old board was removed, and Silver Pines elected new members. We changed the financial rules. Large expenditures required multiple approvals. Homeowners received regular financial statements. Major contracts needed competitive bids and supporting documentation. Independent financial reviews became mandatory. Recovering the money was a different matter. Some could potentially be recovered through restitution, insurance, or legal action. Some might never come back, but something more important changed immediately. People stopped being afraid to ask where their own money was going. I never wanted to run the HOA. I didn't want Marlena's chair. I didn't want power over my neighbors. I wanted 63 families to stop being treated as if asking about their own money was an act of disloyalty. Marlene thought. Authority came from a title, a microphone, a threatening letter, a lien. She was wrong. Real accountability came from something much less dramatic. Records, numbers, questions, and the patience to keep looking when somebody desperately wanted you to stop. So if anyone ever sends you a letter demanding $12,000, before you write the check, ask where the last $900,000 went.